Hey guys, tonight we begin with ancient Rome, the empire that gave us roads, laws, aqueducts, and a long list of historians confidently saying things that later turned out to be wrong. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who else is awake while we casually dismantle centuries of academic confidence. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. When the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD buried the city of Pompeii, historians for centuries imagined something almost tasteful. A sudden catastrophe. One dramatic moment. People froze in mid-action, like carefully arranged statues, as if the entire population politely agreed to become a museum exhibit. It was neat. It was cinematic. It was also completely wrong, because the more archaeologists excavated, the more Pompeii started to look less like a paused painting and more like a very bad day that just kept getting worse. This wasn't a single moment. It was a drawn-out disaster unfolding over hours, maybe longer. And the people inside it were not calmly accepting their fate with philosophical dignity. They were confused, stressed, and making decisions that, in hindsight, feel painfully familiar. At first, there were earthquakes, which, to be fair, were common in the region. So, the average Roman response was essentially, "Ah, yes, the ground is shaking again. Let's continue making lunch." Not unreasonable, just unfortunately optimistic. Inside homes, archaeologists found half-prepared meals, tools left Midas, doors partially sealed, and valuables gathered but not actually taken anywhere useful, which suggests a very human sequence of events. Step 1, mild concern. Step 2, denial. Step 3, maybe we should pack something. Step 4, too late. Some people fled early and survived. Others stayed, likely assuming this would pass like every other inconvenience Rome had thrown at them. After all, when you live in a powerful empire, you start to believe you're slightly immune to consequences. History tends to disagree. Then came the second phase, the part where optimism stopped working. A pyrolastic flow, essentially a fast-moving cloud of superheated gas and ash, surged through the city. Not slowly, not politely. It didn't knock. It didn't give warnings. It arrived like a very aggressive final decision. Bodies found in Pompeii are not peaceful. They are twisted, curled, shielding faces clinging to each other. These are not statues of calm reflection. These are people reacting in their final seconds, which historians had to reluctantly admit is far less aesthetically pleasing, but significantly more accurate. Even worse, or better, if you enjoy unsettling realism, some victims survived the initial ashfall and only died later, meaning they had hours to think about their choices, which frankly is not the kind of historical detail anyone asked for. What Pompeii preserves isn't a snapshot. It's a timeline of hesitation, denial, last-minute planning, and very human miscalculation. And the uncomfortable part is this. If you like to think you would have immediately fled at the first sign of danger, Pompeii quietly suggests otherwise. Because history doesn't just show what happened. It shows exactly how long people can convince themselves that everything is still fine. If you've ever pictured Romans dining elegantly on couches, being fed grapes while discussing philosophy, congratulations, you've been successfully influenced by centuries of very selective storytelling. Because while the wealthy did enjoy elaborate meals, the majority of Romans were doing something far less glamorous and far more familiar. They were eating out constantly. Archaeologists uncovered hundreds of street-side food shops known as thermopolia across cities like Pompeii. And these weren't rare, quirky exceptions. They were everywhere. Entire streets were lined with them, suggesting that Rome didn't just have fast food. It practically ran on it. Each thermopolium featured a stone counter with built-in clay jars filled with hot food ready to serve. Stews, lentils, wine, bread, sometimes meat if you were feeling financially optimistic. It was quick, convenient, and required absolutely no effort beyond pointing and paying, which as it turns out is a timeless business model. Now here's the part historians didn't love admitting. Many Romans didn't even have proper kitchens at home. Apartments, especially in crowded cities, were small, cramped, and often lacked safe cooking spaces. Open flames inside a wooden building packed with people, not ideal. So instead of risking accidental arson before dinner, most people simply stepped outside and grabbed something ready-made. In other words, the average Roman lived in a world where cooking at home was less practical than grabbing street food. Sound familiar? Even better. Some thermopolia show signs of branding, decorations, colorful fresco, even menus painted on the walls. Because apparently Rome not only invented fast food, it also understood marketing. One particularly well-preserved shop in Pompeii displayed painted images of ducks and wine, essentially an ancient version of look at this delicious thing you could be eating right now. Subtlety was not part of the strategy, and the customers, everyone, workers, travelers, slaves, freed men, even the occasional upper-ass Roman who didn't, feel like pretending to cook that day. So, the idea that Rome was a society of disciplined home-cooked meals quietly collapsed under the weight of archaeological evidence and, frankly, common sense. Because when you build one of the largest cities in the ancient world, eventually someone looks at a pot of stew and thinks, what if I sold this and never had to cook again? And just like that, 2,000 years before modern cities, Rome perfected the art of eating quickly, cheaply, and slightly too often. For a long time, historians and engineers agreed on something comforting. Yes, the Romans were impressive, but modern technology had clearly surpassed them. We had better materials, better science, better everything. Then someone looked at a 2,000-year-old Roman structure still standing, and things got awkward. Take the Pantheon. Built nearly 2 millennia ago, it still holds the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. No steel skeleton, no modern reinforcement, just Roman engineering, and what appears to be quiet defiance of physics. Naturally, experts assumed this was simply due to thickness and luck. A lot of thickness and a lot of luck. Then scientists actually analyzed Roman concrete and discovered something mildly humiliating. Unlike modern concrete, which tends to crack, weaken, and demand expensive repairs like a high-maintenance relative, Roman concrete behaves differently when exposed to seawater. It doesn't deteriorate, it strengthens. Chemical reactions inside the material form new minerals that reinforce the structure over time. In other words, Roman concrete doesn't just survive, it improves itself, which is not what anyone expected from a civilization that didn't even have Wi-Fi. Even more inconvenient, Roman harbors built along coastlines have endured constant wave impact for centuries, while many modern equivalents require repairs within decades. Entire piers and breakwaters have simply stayed where they were put, as if they refused to participate in the normal aging process. The secret lies in their ingredients: volcanic ash, lime, and seawater. A combination that modern engineers, despite all their advanced knowledge, only recently began to fully understand. So, for years, the narrative was simple. Ancient equals primitive. Now, it's slightly more uncomfortable. Ancient sometimes equals better, and the Romans likely didn't even realize just how effective their formula was. They weren't writing detailed chemical explanations or publishing research papers. They were just building things that refused to fall apart. Meanwhile, modern infrastructure occasionally struggles to survive a few decades without cracks, repairs, and budget meetings. So, the next time you see a crumbling modern structure next to a Roman one, still standing confidently after 2,000 years, just remember, the Romans didn't just build for their time. They built for a future where people would stare at their work and quietly reconsider everything they thought they knew. Every now and then, archaeology delivers a discovery that expands our understanding of history, and then occasionally, it delivers something that just sits there and refuses to cooperate. Enter the Roman dodecahedrons. Small, hollow, 12-sided bronze objects found across the Roman world from Britain to Central Europe, each one carefully crafted, each face punctured with circular holes of varying sizes, often decorated with knobs at the corners, and absolutely none of them accompanied by instructions, which, as it turns out, is a problem. Because despite decades of study, historians have no definitive idea what these things were used for. Not a clue. Not even a confident guess wearing a lab coat. Naturally, this has led to theories. Many theories. Possibly too many theories. Some suggest they were measuring devices, perhaps for calculating distances or calibrating something. Others believe they were tools for knitting gloves, which is a surprisingly domestic explanation for something that looks like it belongs in a wizard's workshop. There are also proposals involving astronomy, military signaling, religious rituals, and inevitably someone has suggested they were decorative, which is the academic equivalent of saying we give up. The most frustrating part, these objects appear in multiple regions, meaning they were not rare or accidental. People made them intentionally. People used them consistently. People presumably understood them perfectly, and yet they never wrote anything down about them. No manuals, no references in Roman texts, no helpful inscription saying, "This is a dodecahedron. Please use responsibly." Just silence, which leaves modern historians in the uncomfortable position of holding a clearly important object and staring at it like it's judging them. What makes it worse is that the Romans were generally quite good at documenting things. They wrote about engineering, laws, daily life, even insults. But for these, nothing. As if an entire category of objects simply slipped through the cracks of recorded history. So now, centuries later, experts can analyze the medley, map the distribution, measure the symmetry, and still end up with the same conclusion. We don't know. And perhaps that's the most humbling discovery of all. Not that the Romans were mysterious, but that despite all our progress, there are still pieces of their world that remain completely out of reach, sitting quietly, 12-sided, and entirely unimpressed by our attempts to understand them. For a long time, the story was simple, dramatic, and morally satisfying. Gladiators were unfortunate slaves dragged into the arena against their will, forced to fight for survival, while crowds cheered like it was a particularly violent theater performance. It made sense. It fit neatly into the idea of Rome as brutal but predictable. And then historians had to ruin that simplicity, because evidence started to show that not all gladiators were slaves. In fact, a surprising number were volunteers, free Roman men who willingly entered the arena, signed contracts, and said in effect, "Yes, I would like to risk my life for entertainment and potential fame," which is not the career path most guidance counselors recommend. These volunteers were known as octorati, and they weren't necessarily desperate. Some were drawn by money, others by the promise of fame, and a few quite possibly by the ancient. Equivalent of this seems like a good idea at the time. Because here's the part historians didn't fully appreciate at first. Gladiators weren't just fighters. They were celebrities. Graffiti found in places like Pompeii praises specific gladiators by name. Fans wrote about them, admired them, and in some cases very clearly developed strong personal feelings about them. One inscription even describes a gladiator as the delight of all the girls, which suggests that ancient Rome had its own version of a fan club, just with significantly more swords. Successful gladiators could earn money, gifts, and even freedom if they were originally enslaved. They trained in specialized schools, followed strict diets, and were treated as valuable investments. Because from the perspective of their owners or sponsors, a skilled gladiator was not something you casually threw away. Contrary to popular belief, not every fight ended in death. In fact, experienced fighters were often preserved. Killing them too frequently would be like destroying your best performers mid-season. Dramatic, but economically inefficient. So instead of constant slaughter, many matches were carefully controlled displays of skill, endurance, and spectacle. Violence, yes, but structured violence, which somehow makes it more unsettling. This discovery forced historians to reconsider a lot. Rome wasn't just forcing people into brutal entertainment. It had created a system where some individuals actively chose to participate, chasing status in a society that rewarded spectacle, which leaves us with an uncomfortable realization. Ancient Rome didn't just invent violent entertainment. It also invented the idea that if enough people are watching, someone will eventually volunteer to step into the arena. For a long time, the story of women in ancient Rome was presented with remarkable confidence and very little nuance. They stayed at home, had no real power, and existed somewhere in the background of history, occasionally appearing to marry someone important or quietly influence absolutely nothing. It was simple. It was tidy. It was also not particularly accurate, because once historians started paying attention to inscriptions, legal records, and the dangerously revealing habit Romans had of writing things down, a different picture began to emerge, one that was far less convenient. Roman women, while legally restricted in many ways, were far from invisible. In fact, some were economically active, socially influential, and in certain cases, politically persuasive in ways that didn't require official titles. Take property ownership. Contrary to earlier assumptions, many Roman women could own land, manage estates, and run businesses. Widows in particular often had significant financial independence, which means that while Roman law technically limited their public authority, reality quietly ignored that rule whenever it became inconvenient. Then there were the elite women, figures like Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus. Officially, she held no political office. Unofficially, she had influence over decisions that shaped the empire, advising emperors, guiding succession, and generally, proving that power doesn't always need a formal job description. Historians used to downplay this influence, preferring to treat it as incidental or exaggerated. But the more evidence surfaced, the harder it became to ignore. Letters, honors, statues, all suggesting that these women were not passive observers, but active participants in the political and social machinery of Rome. Even in everyday life, women appear far more visible than expected. Shop owners, priestesses, patrons of public works, roles that suggest engagement, not isolation. Now, this doesn't mean Rome was suddenly a model of equality. It wasn't. Legal authority still favored men, and social expectations were very much in place. But the old narrative that women had no agency at all quietly collapsed under the weight of evidence. Because as it turns out, Roman society wasn't a simple hierarchy with everyone neatly in place. It was a system full of unofficial power, subtle influence, and people working around the rules rather than strictly following them. And Roman women, it seems, were particularly good at understanding one important truth. If the system doesn't give you power, you find ways to use it anyway. For a long time, historians like to imagine the Roman world as a very large, very impressive bubble, centered on the Mediterranean, expanding outward, but ultimately self-contained. Rome traded, yes, but mostly within its own orbit. A big system, but still a closed one. It was a comforting idea, manageable, predictable. Then the evidence started showing up in places it absolutely shouldn't have. Roman coins have been found in India, not one or two, but enough to suggest consistent contact. Meanwhile, Roman writers complained quite passionately about silk from the east draining wealth from the empire, which is an oddly specific complaint if no one actually knew where that silk was coming from. Even more inconvenient, luxury goods like spices, gemstones, and textiles were moving across vast distances, passing through multiple hands, cultures, and languages before ending up in Roman markets. And Romans were not just passive recipients. They were active participants in a trade network that stretched far beyond what historians had comfortably mapped. At the center of this was the Silk Road. Not a single road, but a web of routes connecting the Mediterranean to Asia. Through this network, goods moved slowly but steadily, carried by merchants who likely cared less about empire and more about profit margins. And the Romans, they loved it. spices for food, silk for status, exotic goods that signaled wealth and power. Because if there's one thing Rome understood, it was the importance of looking successful, even if it required importing that success from thousands of kilometers away. Archaeological finds also suggest maritime trade routes across the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. Roman ships, or at least ships carrying Roman goods, were traveling farther than once believed. Ports along these routes became bustling centers of exchange, blending cultures in ways that historians had previously underestimated. So the idea that Rome was a self-contained giant quietly collapsed. Instead, it began to look more like an early participant in something much bigger, a connected world where goods, ideas, and influences moved across continents long before anyone thought to call it globalization. And perhaps the most ironic part, while modern historians once underestimated how connected Rome was, the Romans themselves had no such confusion. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were trading, adapting, and reaching outward. Not because they had a grand theory of global exchange, but because somewhere far away there was something valuable, and Rome had already decided it wanted it. For a long time, historians built their understanding of Roman thought from formal sources: speeches, official inscriptions, carefully written literature, the kind of material that sounds respectable, structured, and just intellectual enough to make everyone involved feel very serious. Then someone looked at the walls, specifically the walls of Pompeii, and suddenly, the Roman Empire started sounding a lot less like a Senate debate, and a lot more like an unfiltered group chat. Thousands of pieces of graffiti have been uncovered across Pompeii and other Roman cities. Not grand declarations, not philosophical reflections, just ordinary people writing whatever happened to cross their minds, often permanently and with very little concern for dignity. Some messages are surprisingly poetic, declarations of love, expressions of longing, short verses that suggest Romans had a softer, more reflective side. Others are not. Insults, jokes, complaints about neighbors, crude drawings, and very direct opinions about specific individuals. One message essentially translates to someone announcing their presence in the most casual way possible, the ancient equivalent of, "I was here," but with slightly more attitude. There are political endorsements too. Campaign slogans scratched into walls urging people to vote for certain candidates, because nothing says trusted leadership quite like someone aggressively carving your name into plaster at 3 in the morning. And then there are the personal notes, reminders, advertisements, even schedules. Messages that were never meant to last 2,000 years, now preserved with surprising clarity. What makes this discovery so important and mildly entertaining is that it completely disrupts the polished image of Roman society. These are not elite voices, not curated thoughts. This is everyday Rome, unedited and unapologetically honest. It shows a population that joked, argued, flirted, complained, and occasionally overshared. A society that wasn't constantly thinking about empire, conquest, or philosophy, but about daily life, small frustrations, and very human interactions. In other words, Rome wasn't just grand architecture and disciplined legions. It was people with opinions. And perhaps the most humbling realization is this: after 2,000 years of progress, technology, and cultural evolution, the basic human urge to write something questionable on a wall and leave it there forever has remained remarkably unchanged. For a while, historians had a theory that was almost too perfect. Rome, the greatest empire of the ancient world, didn't fall because of invasions, politics, or economic chaos, but because it accidentally poisoned itself, specifically through lead in pipes, cookware, and even sweetened wine. It was elegant, tragic, a cautionary tale, the kind of explanation that makes everyone nod thoughtfully and say, "Yes, that feels right." There was just one small problem. It wasn't entirely true. Romans absolutely used lead, quite a lot of it. Water pipes known as fistuli often contained lead, and certain food and drink preparations involved it as well. So the idea of widespread poisoning seemed plausible. Too plausible, perhaps. But when researchers took a closer look, the narrative began to crack. First, Roman water systems were more sophisticated than expected. Many aqueducts carried water that flowed continuously, reducing the amount of time it sat in pipes. This limited how much lead could leach into the water. Not perfect, of course, but far from the slow empire-wide poisoning scenario that had been imagined. Second, mineral deposits often formed inside the pipes over time, creating a natural barrier between the water and the lead. Essentially, the pipes coated themselves, which is not something historians originally accounted for, because pipes that solve their own problems tend to complicate simple theories. Then there's the evidence from human remains. Studies of Roman skeletons do show exposure to lead, but not at levels consistent with mass cognitive collapse or societal dysfunction on the scale required to explain the fall of an empire. In other words, Romans may have had some lead exposure, but they weren't collectively wandering around in a poisoned haze, slowly forgetting how to run a civilization, which admittedly would have been a very convenient explanation. Instead, historians were forced to accept something less dramatic and far more complicated. Rome didn't fall because of a single cause. Not lead, not one decision, not one mistake. It was a combination of political instability, economic strain, military pressure, and gradual transformation over time. Messy, layered, and frustratingly resistant to simple storytelling. So, the idea of Rome collapsing because of bad plumbing quietly faded away. And in its place came a more uncomfortable truth. Even the greatest empires don't fall because of one obvious flaw. They fall because of many smaller ones, working together patiently until there's nothing left to hold things up. For centuries, people knew that the Romans had once occupied Britain. There were scattered ruins, the occasional artifact, and of course, the very persistent habit of Romans to leave their mark everywhere they went. But for a long time, the Roman city of Londinium was treated as something partially understood, a modest outpost on the edge of the empire. Important, yes, but hardly central. A provincial town doing its best. Then modern construction began digging deeper into London, and Londinium started to reappear in pieces that didn't quite match the old narrative. Beneath office buildings, roads, and train lines, archaeologists uncovered an entire city, streets, houses, bathhouse, temples, and commercial areas laid out with unmistakable Roman precision. Not a rough settlement, but a structured, functioning, urban center that looked far more organized than historians had comfortably assumed. And then came the writing tablets, thin wooden tablets preserved in waterlogged soil containing ink inscriptions that survived nearly 2,000 years, which is already impressive considering most modern paperwork struggles to survive a spilled coffee. These tablets revealed something even more inconvenient. Everyday life, business contracts, loan agreements, personal messages, complaints. One document dated to around the early years of the city is essentially a financial record. Proof that Londinium wasn't just surviving, it was actively participating in the Roman economy. In other words, this wasn't a distant, forgotten outpost. It was plugged into the system. Trade flowed through it. Money moved through it. People lived, argued, worked, and built their lives there just like in any other Roman city. The empire wasn't just imposing control, it was exporting its entire way of life. Even more surprising, the layout of Londinium suggests planning. Roads intersecting with purpose, infrastructure designed with intent. This wasn't something that accidentally became a city. It was built to be one which forced historians to reconsider a familiar assumption that the edges of the Roman Empire were less developed, less connected, less Roman. Because Londinium clearly didn't get that memo. Instead, it demonstrates something far more interesting. Rome didn't just conquer territory, it replicated itself. And sometimes those replicas were so effective that even after being buried for centuries, they reemerged not as ruins of something primitive, but as evidence of a system that was far more advanced and far more widespread than anyone had fully appreciated. For a long time, the assumption was simple. Ancient medicine was crude, risky, and best avoided unless absolutely necessary. The Romans, despite their engineering brilliance, were thought to approach healthcare with a mixture of guesswork, optimism, and the occasional prayer, which, to be fair, still describes some medical decisions today. Then archaeologists started uncovering Roman surgical kits, and suddenly, that comforting assumption began to look outdated. Excavations across the Roman world revealed collections of instruments that looked surprisingly familiar. Scalpels, forceps, probes, bone levers, even tools designed specifically for delicate procedures. Not rough improvised objects, but carefully crafted instruments with defined purposes. In places like Pompeii, entire medical tool sets have been found, neatly organized, suggesting professional use rather than occasional experimentation. These weren't hobbyists, these were trained practitioners. Roman doctors, often influenced by Greek medical traditions like those of Hippocrates and later thinkers, developed techniques that went far beyond what historians once gave them credit for. They performed cataract surgery using needles to displace the clouded lens. They set broken bones with splints and braces. They treated wounds with a combination of cleaning, stitching, and bandaging. Practices that, while not sterile by modern standards, show a clear understanding of basic medical principles. There's even evidence of battlefield medicine within the Roman army. Military doctors followed legions treating injuries with surprising efficiency because Rome, being Rome, understood one very practical truth. Keeping soldiers alive is generally more useful than replacing them. Of course, this doesn't mean Roman medicine was flawless. Infection was a constant risk, and without modern knowledge of bacteria, many treatments had limited effectiveness. Pain management in particular relied heavily on herbal mixtures that were optimistic at best. But the idea that Roman medicine was entirely primitive, that didn't survive the evidence. Instead, what emerges is a system that was structured, practiced, and in many cases effective enough to make a difference, which leads to a slightly unsettling realization. If you were injured in ancient Rome, your chances were not entirely hopeless. They were just significantly dependent on the skill of someone holding a very sharp instrument with no anesthesia, and a strong belief that this would probably work. For a long time, historians loved the image of the Roman army as a perfectly disciplined machine. Rows of soldiers moving in lockstep, shields aligned, formations executed with mathematical precision, a kind of human wall that advanced slowly and inevitably, like a very organized inconvenience. It looked impressive. It felt logical. It was also only part of the story, because when archaeologists and military historians started examining battlefield evidence, written accounts, and the practical realities of conquest, a different picture began to emerge, one that was far less rigid and far more dangerous. The Roman army wasn't just disciplined, it was adaptable. Take their famous formations. Yes, the Romans could fight in tight structured lines when needed, but they didn't rely on a single approach. Depending on terrain, enemy tactics, and the situation at hand, they adjusted constantly. Open field, tight formation, rough terrain, looser, more flexible movement. Fighting in forests, hills, or unfamiliar environments required improvisation, and the Romans were surprisingly good at it. Encounters with enemies like the Gauls or Germanic tribes forced them to evolve quickly, and rather than stubbornly sticking to tradition, which history has shown is a great way to lose, they adapted. Weapons were modified, strategies were refined, mistakes were occasionally learned from. Even more inconvenient for the old narrative, the Roman army often incorporated foreign tactics and technologies. If an enemy used something effective, Rome didn't dismiss it. It borrowed it, improved it, and then used it against someone else, which is a very efficient, if slightly unsettling approach to warfare. Logistics also played a crucial role. Roman legions built roads, bridges, and camps with remarkable speed, allowing them to move, regroup, and respond faster than most opponents. This wasn't just an army marching to battle. It was an army that brought its own infrastructure with it. And then there was leadership. Commanders were expected to make decisions based on real conditions, not just follow a script. Flexibility wasn't a weakness. It was part of the system. So the idea of Rome winning through rigid discipline alone quietly collapsed. Instead, what we see is something far more effective. An army that combines structure with adaptability, order with improvisation, which, as it turns out, is far more difficult to defeat than a force that only knows how to do one thing well. Because the Roman army didn't just fight battles. It learned how to win them repeatedly and adjusted every time it had to. For a long time, history focused on the grand names, emperors, generals, and the occasional philosopher who looked impressive in marble. Figures like Augustus dominated the narrative, giving the impression that Rome was shaped almost entirely by powerful individuals making very important decisions. Which is technically true, but also wildly incomplete. Because once archaeologists started uncovering everyday documents, letters, receipts, contracts, something unexpected happened. Rome became relatable. In places like Pompeii and Vinderanda, preserved writing tablets revealed the private lives of ordinary people. Not heroic speeches, not official decrees, just daily communication, the kind never meant to survive 2,000 years. And that's exactly what makes them so revealing. There are invitations to birthday parties, casual notes between friends, requests for supplies that sound suspiciously like someone reminding a colleague not to forget basic items. One letter even includes what is essentially a polite complaint. The ancient equivalent of "you said you'd send this, and you didn't." In other words, Romans worried about the same things we do. Work, social obligations, logistics, mild irritation with other people. There are also financial records, loans, payments, debts, showing a society deeply engaged in trade and personal economy. People tracked what they owed, negotiated terms, and occasionally, one assumes, tried to avoid paying. Because some traditions, it seems, are eternal. Even more striking are the emotional details. Messages expressing affection, concern, and frustration. Small glimpses into relationships that feel surprisingly modern. These weren't distant figures living in a fundamentally different world. They were individuals navigating daily life with all its complications. And suddenly the image of Rome changes. It's no longer just monumental architecture and political power. It's conversations, arguments, plans that didn't quite work out. People trying to manage their lives within a vast and complex system. Which leads to a realization that historians didn't always emphasize the Roman Empire wasn't just built by emperors. It was sustained by millions of ordinary people doing ordinary things and occasionally writing them down in ways that would outlast them by centuries. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how little has changed. Because when you strip away the time, the language, and the setting, you're left with something very familiar. People trying to organize their lives, communicate clearly, and deal with each other with varying degrees of success. For a long time, the standard image of Roman entertainment was simple. Gladiators fighting in the arena, crowds cheering, occasional, dramatic thumbs involved. Brutal, yes, but predictable. It fit neatly into the idea that Rome enjoyed violence and didn't feel the need to complicate it. Then historians started looking closer at what actually happened inside venues like the Colosseum, and things became far less straightforward because Roman entertainment wasn't just about fighting. It was about spectacle on a scale that feels less like a sporting event and more like an entire production team got unlimited funding and absolutely no restrictions. Take staged naval battles known as namakia. In some cases, arenas were flooded to recreate sea battles, complete with ships, costumes, and participants who were very much not actors in the modern sense. The logistics alone are impressive. The Millennia's willingness to do this repeatedly is something else entirely. Then there were elaborate reenactments of myths and historical events, except instead of symbolic performances, these often involved real consequences for the participants. If a story required someone to meet an unfortunate end, The Romans did not believe in half measures. Because subtlety as a concept had not yet been invited to the empire, wild animals were imported from across the known world. Lions, elephants, exotic species that most spectators had never seen before. All brought into the arena to create moments of shock and awe. The goal wasn't just entertainment, it was overwhelming the senses. And it worked. Crowds didn't attend these events quietly. They reacted, shouted, participated emotionally. The arena wasn't just a place to watch. It was a place to feel something intense, immediate, and very difficult to ignore. What historians underestimated wasn't the brutality. It was the creativity. Rome didn't just host violent games. It engineered experiences, carefully designed, carefully staged, and constantly evolving to keep audiences engaged. Because if there's one thing the Romans understood, it was that attention is valuable, and losing it is not an option. Which leads to a slightly uncomfortable realization. Ancient Rome didn't just invent large-scale entertainment. It perfected the idea that if you want to keep people watching, you don't hold back. You escalate, preferably with water, wild animals, and a budget that suggests no one ever said the word enough. For centuries, the story of Rome's end was told like a dramatic finale, a mighty empire collapsing in a single decisive moment. One year, one event, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, when everything simply stopped. Civilization fades, curtains close, history moves on. It's a great story. It's also not how it happened. Because when historians started looking beyond that convenient date, the narrative began to unravel. Not dramatically, but slowly, which is unfortunately how most real things happen. The so-called fall wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a long, uneven process. Political power weakened, leadership became unstable, economies strained, and military pressures increased. None of these alone ended Rome. Together, over time, they changed it gradually, almost quietly. In fact, many people living during this period wouldn't have described their world as ending at all. Life continued. Markets still operated. People still worked, married, argued, and paid taxes, often reluctantly, but consistently. Even after traditional Roman authority declined in the West, Roman systems didn't vanish overnight. They adapted. Local rulers took over. Structures shifted. The empire didn't disappear so much as transform into something less recognizable. Meanwhile, the eastern half of the empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly 1,000 more years, which is an inconvenient detail if you're trying to present Rome's fall as a clean, dramatic conclusion, because history once again refused to cooperate. What really happened is far less cinematic, but far more realistic. Rome didn't collapse like a building. It eroded like a coastline bit by bit, piece by piece, until the shape changed so much that people later look back and try to decide when exactly it stopped being Rome. And the answer is complicated because there isn't one moment where everything ends. There's just a series of changes that over time become impossible to ignore, which leaves us with a final, slightly unsettling realization. Even the greatest empires don't announce their ending. They simply keep going until one day someone looks around and realizes they've become something else entirely. Night does not simply arrive at a medieval castle. It is announced, negotiated, and then physically forced into submission by several men with very large keys and even larger trust issues. As the sun begins its slow retreat behind the hills, the castle stirs, not into sleep, but into preparation. The outer gate, which has spent the entire day welcoming traders, messengers, and the occasional suspicious monk, now becomes deeply unfriendly. Guards exchange glances that suggest they trust absolutely no one, especially anyone still outside. The first signal is the horn, low, drawn out, and impossible to ignore. It echoes across the fields, bouncing off stone walls and drifting toward nearby villages like a polite warning. If you're not inside by now, you've made a poor life decision. Then comes the movement. Chains creak. The heavy wooden gates begin to swing inward with the slow reluctance of something that has done this every night for decades and still hates it. Each plank is thick, reinforced with iron bands scarred from weather, war, and the occasional drunk noble who thought kicking it was a good idea. Above on the gatehouse, archers take position, not because something is happening, but because something might. Medieval life is built entirely around that kind of optimism. The portcullis follows, a lattice of iron descending with a grinding sound that feels final. Once it hits the ground, that's it. No late entries, no exceptions. Not for merchants, not for travelers, not even for that one guy who definitely just went out for a minute. Inside the walls, the mood shifts. The courtyard, busy just moments ago, begins to thin. Stable boys hurry to finish their work, leading horses into shelter. Servants carry the last supplies indoors, arms full, steps quick. No one lingers without a reason. And even then they reconsider, because once the gates close, the castle becomes a world unto itself. Outside is darkness, uncertainty, and whatever happens to be wandering through the woods tonight. Inside is order, hierarchy, and slightly better chances of survival. A guard gives the final inspection, running his hand along the locked beam that secures the gate. He nods, satisfied, as if personally responsible for holding back the entire medieval world. And just like that, the castle is sealed. Not asleep. Not yet. Just safely trapped with itself. With the gates sealed and the outside world politely excluded, the castle turns inward, and responsibility quietly changes hands. Because while nobles prepare for comfort and servants for exhaustion, the guards prepare for something far less glamorous: staying awake. The changing of the guard begins in the courtyard beneath torchlight that flickers just enough to make everyone look slightly suspicious. The day watch, who have spent hours pretending not to be bored, now shuffle toward relief with the subtle dignity of men whose feet hurt more than they'd like to admit. The night watch, on the other hand, arrives with that particular mix of confidence and regret. Confidence because they are now in charge. Regret because they will shortly discover that being in charge mostly involves standing still in the cold, while questioning every shadow like it owes them money. Weapons are checked first. Spears, crossbows, swords, nothing ornate, nothing heroic, just practical tools designed to solve problems quickly. A dull blade is quietly corrected. A loose strap is tightened. There is no room for error when the nearest backup is often just another equally tired man with similar doubts. Instructions are exchanged in low voices. Keep an eye on the east wall. Someone heard movement near the lower yard last night. Don't fall asleep again. That last one is delivered with a glance that suggests a previous incident no one has fully forgiven. Above them, along the battlements, positions are taken. One guard at each tower, spaced carefully along the walls, each man responsible for a slice of darkness that stretches far beyond what he can actually see. Torches burn, but not too brightly. Light is useful, but it also announces exactly where you are, which is less helpful if someone outside has less friendly intentions. The castle settles into a different rhythm now. Slower, quieter, more deliberate. Footsteps echo more clearly. Voices drop lower. Every small sound, boots on stone, the creak of wood, the distant clatter of something being dropped carries farther than it should. And the guards listen, not because they expect something to happen, but because occasionally something does. A shape moves beyond the wall. Probably an animal, possibly not. A gust of wind rattles a loose shutter, almost certainly just the wind. Still, eyes narrow, hands tighten around weapons. No one assumes safety. Not entirely. Because the truth is simple. The castle may be locked, but the night is still very much outside. While the guards inherit the cold and the shadows, the nobles inherit something far more agreeable: privacy, warmth, and the illusion that the world beyond the walls has politely stopped existing for the night. The great hall, once loud with voices, clinking cups, and the theatrical storytelling of men who were definitely not exaggerating, begins to empty. One by one, the lords and ladies withdraw, their departures gradual but unmistakable. Conversations fade mid-sentence, laughter softens, and even the fire seems to settle into a quieter burn, as if aware that it no longer needs to perform. A noble does not simply go to bed. That would be far too efficient. Instead, there is a slow procession back to their chambers, often accompanied by servants carrying candles, extra blankets, and occasionally, the weight of their employer's expectations. The corridors glow in soft wavering light, shadows stretching along stone walls like they're trying to eavesdrop. Inside the chambers, the temperature shifts immediately. Thick tapestries hang from the walls, not just for decoration, but to trap warmth and keep the creeping cold at bay. Beds are prepared in advance, layered with furs and linen, large enough to suggest comfort, though not always guaranteed to deliver it. Clothing is shed in stages, with the help of servants who have mastered the delicate art of being present, but invisible. Jewelry is removed, belts loosened, heavy garments folded away. The transformation is subtle but significant. The armor of status gives way to something softer, more human, and yet even here, the hierarchy remains. A lord may lie down knowing guards stand watch outside. Servants remain awake nearby, and the castle itself functions around him like a well-rehearsed machine. Security is not questioned, it is expected, but comfort does not always mean peace. Candles flicker beside the bed, casting restless shadows across the ceiling. The silence, now that it has fully arrived, feels different from the noise it replaced. Thoughts previously drowned in conversation return with surprising clarity. Decisions made during the day linger. Conversations replay. Doubts carefully ignored in daylight become harder to dismiss. In the quiet outside, footsteps echo faintly in the corridors. A distant door closes. Somewhere, a guard coughs into the night. The castle is calm, ordered, secure. But within these chambers, behind thick walls and heavy doors, sleep does not come as easily as the setting might suggest. Because even in a fortress, the mind remains remarkably difficult to lock away. While nobles drift toward uneasy comfort and guards negotiate with the darkness, the servants remain, quietly holding the entire illusion together. Because a medieval castle does not simply stop functioning at night. It winds down reluctantly, like a machine that resents being turned off but knows it has no choice. In the kitchens, the day lingers longer than anywhere else. The great hearth, which has spent hours roaring like a beast, now burns lower, though not entirely out. Pots are scrubbed with the kind of determination usually reserved for personal grudges. Grease, ash, and the remains of an entire day's labor cling stubbornly to surfaces, and the servants, equally stubborn, fight back with water, cloth, and a level of patience no one celebrates. The air is thick, smoke, heat, and the fading scent of food. It settles into clothes, hair, and lungs, a quiet reminder that tomorrow will be exactly the same. Elsewhere, in dim corridors, chamber servants move like shadows. Candles are trimmed, doors are checked, beds are adjusted one final time, even though no one will notice. Small details are corrected, not for praise, but because they must be. A misplaced object, a draft slipping through a poorly closed window, a blanket not properly aligned. These are not disasters, but they are opportunities for someone else to be displeased tomorrow. And displeasure in a castle travels quickly. In the stables, the work is slower, quieter. Horses shift in their stalls, restless but settling. A stable boy moves between them, checking straps, laying fresh hay, murmuring softly. Not because the horses understand, but because silence here feels too heavy. Even the animals seem aware. That night has weight. Back inside, the final rounds begin. A senior servant walks the halls with practiced eyes, noticing everything, commenting on nothing. A glance is enough. A raised eyebrow carries meaning. Instructions are given in whispers, corrections made without ceremony. There is no applause. At the end of this performance, only completion. One by one, tasks disappear. The kitchen dims, the corridors empty. Doors close softly, carefully, as if the castle itself might wake if disturbed. And eventually the servants retreat, not to comfort, but to rest just sufficient enough to do it all again. Because in a place built on hierarchy and power, the quiet truth remains. The castle sleeps, because they allowed it to. By now, the castle has done everything expected of it. The gates are locked, the guards are posted, the nobles are horizontal, and the servants have finally stopped moving long enough to remember they are in fact human. And yet the castle is not still. It breathes, not in any mystical sense. No ancient spirits required, no dramatic chanting in Latin, but in the far more unsettling way large old structures behave when left alone with time and temperature. Stone cools, wood contracts, iron shifts just enough to remind you it exists. What was silent in the day now produces an orchestra of small suspicious noises. A beam cocks slowly, deliberately, like it's thinking about something. Somewhere in the walls, a faint scratching sound appears. Probably rats. Almost certainly rats. But in the medieval imagination, probably rats, has a remarkable ability to become something much worse. After midnight, the corridors, now empty, amplify everything. A single drip of water echoes as if the castle is counting seconds. Footsteps, real or imagined, seem to linger longer than they should. Even the torches, those loyal little sons of the medieval world, flicker in ways that suggest they might be slightly unreliable narrators. On the battlements, a guard pauses. He hears something. He always hears something. A distant rustle beyond the wall. Wind in the grass, most likely. But the human brain, especially when deprived of warmth and sleep, is a creative machine. It offers possibilities, none of them comforting. He stares into the darkness as if it might politely explain itself. It does not. Inside the castle, in its deeper corners, storage rooms, unused corridors, stairwells that seem to exist purely to confuse visitors. The darkness gathers more confidently. These are places untouched by routine, where even servants prefer not to linger unless absolutely necessary. Not because something is there, but because nothing is there, and that, oddly enough, feels worse. The castle shifts again. A door settles into its frame with a dull thud. A loose shutter taps lightly against it. Stone. The wind slips through narrow openings, carrying a low, almost human sound as it moves. It is easy in these moments to believe the castle is alive, not watching, not thinking, just existing. Old, heavy, and very aware of its own presence. And, as the night deepens, one quiet truth becomes clear. The people inside the castle may believe they control it, but for these few hours, in the long stretch between dusk and dawn, it feels very much the other way around. By the middle of the night, the castle has settled into that peculiar silence that is never truly silent. It is a quiet filled with layers, breathing, shifting, waiting, and occasionally speaking. Not loudly, not clearly, but enough. In the corridors, where torchlight has begun to shrink and retreat, shadows take on a different character. They no longer simply exist. They linger. A servant passing through with a final errand walks a little faster than necessary, not because of anything specific, just a general agreement with their own instincts that this is not the hour to take one's time. And then there are the whispers, not conversations exactly, more like fragments, a sound that resembles a voice carried by the wind through narrow stone passages, a murmur just beyond clarity, as if two people are speaking in the next room. But when checked, there is no next room, just wall. A guard posted near an inner corridor tilts his head slightly. He hears something behind him. He turns. Nothing. Of course, nothing. Still, he adjusts his grip on the spear. Not dramatically. Just enough to remind himself that he is theoretically prepared for whatever explanation eventually presents itself. The truth, as always, is less satisfying. Stone carries sound. Air moves in unpredictable ways. The castle, with its thick walls and narrow passages, is very good at taking a perfectly ordinary noise and delivering it somewhere else entirely, transformed into something far more interesting. A dropped object in the kitchens becomes a faint echo near the chapel. A shifting beam in a tower becomes a low voice in a hallway. A distant cough becomes something less identifiable. And once the mind begins to interpret these sounds, it does not easily stop. In the sleeping chambers, some wake briefly, not fully, just enough to register that something feels different. A flicker of unease passes through like a shadow across thought, and then fades. The blanket is adjusted. The eyes close again. Outside, the wind presses gently against the walls, slipping through cracks, finding its way into spaces no one thinks about during the day. It hums softly, a low, constant presence that fills the gaps between other sounds. If the castle breathes, this is its voice, not words, not meaning. Just a reminder that in the hours when human activity fades, something else, far less concern, with schedules or comfort, takes over the conversation. And no one, not even the guards, can quite say where it begins or ends. There is a moment in the night when time itself seems to hesitate, not stop. Nothing so dramatic, but slow just enough to make every second feel slightly heavier than the last. This is the midnight hour. No bells need to ring for anyone to notice it. The body feels it. The guards standing along the wall shift their weight more often now. The cold has settled in properly. No longer a passing discomfort, but a quiet, persistent companion. Fingers stiffen. Breath becomes visible. Even the most alert mind begins to negotiate with sleep. One guard leans slightly against the stone, behind him, just for a moment, just enough to ease the strain. His eyes remain open mostly. The darkness ahead is unchanged, but it somehow feels deeper now, less like empty space, and more like something that could, if it wished, step forward. He straightens again immediately, because that is how mistakes begin. Elsewhere, the castle holds its breath. The kitchens are dark, the hearth reduced to faint embers that glow like distant eyes before dimming again. The corridors, once filled with motion, are now entirely still. Doors remain closed. No footsteps echo. No voices interrupt. Even the servants, those tireless keepers of everything, have finally surrendered to rest, though lightly as always. One ear open to the possibility of being needed again. Because in a castle, someone always needs something at the worst possible hour. In the noble chambers, sleep is uneven. Some rest deeply, wrapped in layers of warmth and confidence. Others turn slowly, caught between dreams and thoughts they would rather not revisit. The silence presses differently here, less threatening perhaps, but no less present. And then there is the chapel, empty, cold, watching nothing, and yet somehow feeling like it notices everything. The candles have long since burned down, leaving behind only the faint scent of wax and something older, something harder to name. If any place in the castle understands midnight, it is this one. Because midnight is not just a time, it is a threshold. Behind it lies the familiar, the routines of the day, the comfort of light, the illusion of control. Ahead of it, well, ahead of it is the long stretch where certainty fades and imagination quietly takes over. And as the night deepens past this invisible line, one thing becomes increasingly clear. If anything were going to happen, this would be the hour it chooses. Midnight passes without incident, disappointing for the imagination, reassuring for everyone else. But night is not finished yet. It rarely leaves without lingering, as if reluctant to surrender its quiet control. The hours that follow are thinner, stretched, less dramatic perhaps, but more exhausting. This is when even the most disciplined guard begins to feel the weight of time pressing down like a slow, invisible hand. On the battlements, the air has changed. It is colder now, sharper, the kind of cold that seeps through fabric and settles into bone with quiet determination. A guard exhales and watches the breath drift away as if confirming that he is still present, still part of the world, despite the creeping sense that everything has paused. He shifts again, not out of boredom, but necessity, because this is the hour when fatigue becomes persuasive. Eyes burn slightly. Thoughts drift. The mind, no longer fully anchored, begins to wander to memories, to plans, to absolutely anything more interesting than staring into darkness that refuses to reveal its secrets. And yet, this is also the hour when the darkness begins to lose slowly, almost reluctantly. At first, it is nothing more than a suggestion. The black horizon softens, not lighter exactly, but less absolute. Shapes begin to re-emerge, faint outlines separating themselves from the void. The world outside the walls, which has spent hours hiding, starts to reconsider its position. Inside the castle, something subtle shifts. A servant stirs before waking, not fully conscious, but aware in the way the body recognizes change before the mind does. The air feels different. The silence, though still present, carries a hint of something approaching. In the stables, horses move more deliberately now. Hooves press softly against straw. A low, quiet sound escapes one of them. Not restless, just expectant. Even the castle itself seems to ease. The creaks and whispers that filled the night begin to fade, not because they are gone, but because they are no longer alone. A faint breeze carries a different tone, a distant bird, early, optimistic, possibly misguided, makes a brief attempt at song before thinking better of it. And in that moment, the long tension of the night begins to unravel. Not all at once. Nothing so generous, but enough. Because dawn is coming, and with it, the return of movement, noise, purpose, the things that make the castle feel controlled again. For now, though, the night still holds its ground, fading. Yes, but not quite finished yet. Dawn does not burst into a medieval castle. It seeps in quietly, persistently, like something reclaiming territory it never truly lost. At first, it is only light. A thin, pale glow slips through narrow windows and arrow slits, stretching across stone floors in long, hesitant lines. It touches the walls, the doors, the sleeping figures within, as if testing whether the night is ready to let go. The shadows, so confident just hours ago, begin to retreat without argument. On the battlements, the guards notice it first, not because they are particularly observant, but because they have been waiting for it, with the patience of men who would very much like to stop standing in the cold. One shifts, rolling his shoulders, feeling life, return to muscles that have spent hours pretending not to exist. Another glances toward the horizon, now clearly visible. The darkness has loosened its grip. The world beyond the walls, fields, trees, distant paths reappears, slightly softened by the early light, but undeniably real again. Nothing attacked. Nothing emerged from the shadows. The night, for all its quiet threats and imagined possibilities, has done absolutely nothing. A deeply satisfying outcome. Inside the castle, movement returns in fragments. A door opens somewhere down a corridor. Slow, careful, as if unsure whether it is allowed, a servant steps out blinking at the light, already calculating the tasks ahead. The day has not begun officially, but it is approaching with clear intentions. In the kitchens, embers are stirred back to life. A faint glow becomes flame again, small at first, then steady. The air begins to shift. Cool night, giving way to the promise of warmth, smoke, and routine. In the noble chambers, Sleep loosens its hold. One stirs, then another. Blankets shift, a quiet sigh. The mind returns reluctantly to responsibility, to decisions postponed, to conversations that will resume as if the night never happened, because in a way it didn't. The castle, which spent hours breathing, whispering, and quietly asserting its presence, now becomes something else entirely, structured, controlled, obedient to the demands of daylight. The gates will open again. Voices will rise. Movement will fill every corridor, and no one will speak of the night. Not the sounds, not the silence, not the feeling that for a few hours the castle belonged to something else. Instead, the routine continues as it always does until the sun falls again and the cycle begins patiently waiting to repeat itself. Before the ships stretched across the horizon like floating cities, before foreign kings bowed in confusion, before entire oceans became highways of imperial ambition, there was a boy who by every reasonable expectation was supposed to disappear into history. Shanghur did not begin life as an admiral. He did not even begin life with the luxury of choosing his own direction. Born in a remote region during a time of shifting power, his early years were shaped by forces far larger than anything he could control. And then, as history often does when it is feeling particularly dramatic, it intervened. A military campaign reached his homeland. It did not ask permission. He was captured, young, unknown, and entirely unimportant in the grand design of empires. Taken to serve within the machinery of the rising Ming dynasty, he entered a world defined by hierarchy, discipline, and quiet competition. It was not a place where someone like him was expected to rise. It was a place where most simply endured, and yet he did not remain unnoticed. Within the orbit of the Yongle Emperor, a man who had claimed power through force and now intended to secure it through spectacle. Young, he proved something rare. Not strength alone, many possessed that. Not loyalty alone, most were required to demonstrate it, but intelligence, adaptability, and a kind of presence that made others pay attention, even when they were not entirely sure why. The emperor, who trusted few and tested everyone, saw potential. And potential in an imperial court is a dangerous thing, because once it is recognized, it demands to be used. He was drawn closer to power step by step, not through inheritance or privilege, but through usefulness. He learned quickly, observed carefully, spoke when necessary, and remained silent when it mattered more. In a court filled with ambition, he mastered something rarer: control. But none of this explains what comes next, because rising within a palace is one thing. Being handed command of the largest naval expeditions the world had ever seen is something else. Entirely. Somewhere between servant and strategist, between outsider and trusted figure, Jung-He crossed an invisible threshold, the kind history rarely notices in the moment, but later builds entire legends around. And when that moment came, it would not be quiet. It would arrive with ships, and those ships did not appear out of curiosity. They appeared because one man decided the world needed a reminder. Yongle Emperor was not the kind of ruler who settled comfortably into power. He had taken the throne through conflict, not inheritance, which meant legitimacy was always negotiable. And when legitimacy is uncertain, subtlety tends to disappear. So he chose scale instead. If rivals questioned his rule, he would not argue. He would overwhelm, not just within China, but beyond it, across oceans, across cultures that had never even considered the existence of a ruler like him. The message was simple. The Ming dynasty was not just stable, it was dominant, and it intended to be noticed. This was not exploration in the gentle, curious sense. It was projection of wealth, power, order, and the quiet expectation that others would recognize their place within it. The emperor envisioned fleets so large they would feel less like expeditions and more like moving cities. Ships carrying silk, porcelain, precious metals, not as trade goods in the traditional sense, but as statements. Gifts, technically, though gift in this context came with the unspoken understanding that returning the favor would be wise, very wise. But ambition alone does not build fleets. It requires organization, resources, and above all, someone capable of turning vision into reality. Someone who understood not just command, but coordination on a scale that bordered on absurd. Which brings us back to Janghur. He was not the obvious choice. That in many ways made him the perfect one, trusted, capable, and perhaps most importantly, loyal to the emperor personally, rather than to any competing faction. Yonghur became the instrument through which this ambition would take form. Orders were given. Shipyards expanded. Timber was gathered in quantities that suggested entire forests were being quietly erased from the map. Craftsmen, sailors, soldiers, translators, thousands upon thousands of individuals were drawn into the project, each contributing a small piece to something none of them could fully comprehend. The coastline transformed. Where there had been ordinary harbors, there now rose the beginnings of something extraordinary. Holes took shape. Masts climbed skyward. Sails were prepared like banners waiting for an audience. And beneath it all, a single idea drove everything forward. The world would see this fleet, whether it was ready or not. And so, the idea became wood, then rope, then something far more unsettling, scale. Along the shipyards of the Ming coast, the vision of the Yongle Emperor stopped being theoretical and began to occupy space. A great deal of space, the kind that forces people to stop mid-step and quietly reconsider how large human ambition is allowed to be. This was not a fleet in the ordinary sense. It was a floating statement. Under the direction of Yonghur, ships rose one after another, each different in purpose but united in scale. Massive treasure ships, their hulls towering above the docks. Supply vessels packed with food, water, and the practical necessities of a not dying at sea. Warships because optimism has limits, and smaller support craft moving constantly between them, like ants maintaining a very expensive structure. The noise never stopped. Axes striking timber, ropes pulled tight. Orders shouted, repeated and shouted again. The air filled with sawdust, salt, and the kind of urgency that only exists when thousands of people are working towards something they don't fully understand but are absolutely expected to complete. Sailors arrived in waves, some experienced, many not. They came from across the empire. Men who had known rivers now asked to face oceans. Men who had never seen water beyond a shoreline now expected to trust it completely. Training was efficient. Learn quickly or learn permanently. Translators, scribes, and envoys were gathered as well, because this was not merely a journey of movement. It was a journey of interaction. Languages would need to be understood, customs navigated, offense avoided when possible, delivered when necessary. And then there were the cargo holds, silk folded with care, porcelain packed with precision, precious goods, not just for trade, but for display. Each item a quiet declaration of refinement, wealth, and a culture that considered itself quite reasonably the center of the world. All of it loaded, all of it catalogued, all of it ready. From the docks, the fleet stretched outward until it blurred into the horizon. Massed like a forest of wood and canvas, hulls shifting gently with the tide, as if impatient. It was too large to feel temporary, too organized to feel accidental, and yet beneath the scale in the spectacle, there was a question no one could quite answer. What happens when something this massive leaves? And then, inevitably, it leaves. There is no dramatic countdown, no final speech that echoes across the docks. Just movement, slow at first, almost hesitant, as if even something this enormous needs a moment to convince itself that it can actually go. The great ships of Jung, begin to pull away from the shore one by one, guided by smaller vessels and a great deal of shouted coordination. Ropes are loosened. Sails unfurl, catching wind like something waking up after a long sleep. The coastline, so dominant just moments ago, begins to shrink, and with it, certainty. For many aboard, this is the first time the land has ever left them, not the other way around. It recedes steadily, becoming a line, then a suggestion, then nothing at all. The world they understood is now behind them, and ahead, well, ahead is water, a lot of it. The fleet stretches across the sea in careful formation, a moving constellation of wood and canvas. Signals pass between ships, flags, drums, fire at night. Because when you command something this vast, communication becomes less a convenience and more a necessity for survival. The ocean, for its part, is unimpressed. It does not react. It does not acknowledge the scale, the ambition, or the quiet confidence of the Ming dynasty. It simply exists, wide, unpredictable, and entirely uninterested in human plans. Days pass, then more days. Routine settles in. Sails are adjusted. Decks are cleaned. Meals are prepared with varying degrees of success. The initial excitement fades, replaced by something steadier, more subdued. Life at sea becomes repetitive, almost meditative, if one ignores the constant underlying awareness that a single mistake could become a very permanent problem. Storms arrive occasionally, not as grand cinematic events, but as sudden reminders of scale. Wind shifts, waves rise, the ships endure, flexing and creaking, but holding together through design, experience, and a fair amount of collective hope. And through it all, Jiangha remains at the center, not always visible, but always present in the structure of it all. Orders move outward from him, rippling through the fleet with quiet authority. This is no longer preparation, no longer ambition. This is execution. The fleet moves forward deeper into waters that grow less familiar with each passing day. Behind them lies the certainty of empire. Ahead of them lies something else entirely. Not chaos, not danger necessarily, but possibility, the kind that does not ask permission before changing everything. And eventually, the horizon stops being empty. After days, sometimes weeks of nothing but water and sky, negotiating their endless agreement, shapes begin to emerge, faint at first, as much a line, then unmistakably land. For the fleet of Yanghur, these moments are not surprises, they are expectations fulfilled. The routes, though vast, are not entirely unknown. Traders have passed through these waters before. Stories have circulated. Maps incomplete, but confident have been consulted. But no one arrives like this. As the ships draw closer, the coastline reveals itself. Ports, settlements, people who had woken that morning expecting an ordinary day. And then gradually, the horizon fills with sails. Not one, not a handful, dozens. An entire floating city approaching without explanation. On shore, reactions vary. Curiosity, confusion, concern. A crowd gathers because that is what humans do when confronted with something they cannot immediately categorize. Some point, some retreat. Some simply watch, trying to decide whether this is an opportunity or a problem. The answer, as it turns out, is both. The ships anchor with a deliberate calm. Smaller boats are lowered, carrying envoys dressed not for battle, but for presentation. Silk flows where armor might have been. Gifts are carried carefully, visibly, because this is not a confrontation. Not yet. When representatives of the local rulers arrive, the exchange begins. Formal, measured, wrapped in politeness that hides a great deal of calculation on both sides. The message from the Ming dynasty is clear, even when not stated directly. We are powerful. We are generous. We are here. Recognition is expected. Tribute is encouraged. Cooperation is advisable. And yet, the encounters are not one-sided. The fleet brings goods outward, but it also receives exotic animals, unfamiliar objects, stories from distant lands. Each interaction expanding the understanding of the world, even as it reinforces the empire's belief in its own centrality. There is tension, occasionally, misunderstandings, moments where politeness strains under the weight of cultural difference, but more often, there is a careful balance, a mutual agreement to proceed without testing the limits too aggressively, because everyone present understands something important. This fleet did not come by accident, and it did not come weak. So, the exchanges continue port after port, kingdom after kingdom, each one adding to a growing network of contact, influence, and quiet obligation. And with each departure, as the sails rise again and the ships turn back toward open water, one question lingers behind them. What exactly have they just set in motion? And what they set in motion does not remain at the docks. It travels. With each departure, the fleet does not simply leave a place behind. It carries it forward. Names, faces, customs, promises, all folded neatly into memory, recorded by scribes, interpreted by envoys, and quietly reshaped into something useful for the Ming dynasty. Because this is no longer just a journey. It is a system. Under the steady direction of Younger, diplomacy becomes something physical, tangible, measurable in silk bolts, lacquered boxes, rare woods, spices and objects that seem ordinary in one land and extraordinary in another. Gifts are exchanged again and again, but the word gift remains slightly misleading. These are not casual offerings. They are carefully chosen signals. Silk, smooth and impossibly refined, suggests a civilization that values beauty and control. Porcelain, delicate yet precise, implies mastery over craft and material. Each item whispers the same message. This empire is not only powerful, it is sophisticated. And in return, foreign courts respond. Not always out of admiration, sometimes out of caution, occasionally out of genuine curiosity, but almost always with an awareness that refusing such gestures outright would be unwise. So they send their own offerings. Animals never seen in China, objects shaped by entirely different traditions, rare materials drawn from landscapes that exist far beyond the emperor's direct reach. Each exchange becomes a quiet negotiation, not just of goods, but of status. Because recognition flows both ways. Envoys travel with the fleet, moving between cultures with careful precision. Words are chosen slowly, translated carefully, repeated when necessary. A single misunderstanding could shift the tone from polite to tense, and tension in unfamiliar territory is rarely useful. Still, the system works. Ports become familiar, routes grow more defined. What was once distant begins to feel connected, not equal, not unified, but linked through repeated contact and mutual awareness. The fleet becomes known not just as a collection of ships, but as a presence, something expected, something that arrives, impresses, exchanges and moves on, leaving behind a subtle change in how the world understands itself. And yet, beneath the surface of this growing network, something quieter begins to form, a question not yet fully asked. If diplomacy is carried by wind and silk, what happens when the wind stops? And eventually, the wind does hesitate, not at sea, not in the predictable, inconvenient way sailors expect, but far away from the waves. In the place where all of this truly begins and ends, the court of the Ming dynasty. Because while the fleets of Jiang move with precision across oceans, the empire behind them shifts in quieter, more complicated ways. Power, as it turns out, is not a single voice. It is a conversation, often an argument at court. Not everyone is impressed by distant ports or exotic animals politely arriving as tribute. Not everyone sees value in sending vast resources across oceans to impress rulers who inconveniently do not live within China's borders. Some see cost, forests cut for timber, labor drawn away from other needs, wealth distributed outward rather than reinforced inward. For every display of strength abroad, there is a question at home. Is this necessary? And questions once asked tend to multiply. The young emperor had driven these voyages forward with force of will and a clear sense of purpose. But emperors, despite their titles, are not permanent. Their ambitions, no matter how grand, eventually pass into the hands of others. People who may not share the same enthusiasm for proving a point across oceans. The tone begins to change, not suddenly. Nothing so dramatic, more like a quiet adjustment. Orders become less frequent. Funding becomes more carefully considered. The enthusiasm that once fueled entire shipyards begins to feel measured, controlled, as if someone somewhere has decided that perhaps the world does not need quite so many reminders of Mengi. Power. Meanwhile, the fleets continue. They sail. They arrive. They exchange. They maintain the system that has been built with such careful effort. But beneath the surface, something has shifted. Momentum is no longer guaranteed. Shang experienced enough to recognize patterns before they fully form. Understands this, not as a crisis, but as a limit. A boundary that had always existed, waiting patiently for attention. Because no matter how vast the fleet, no matter how far it travels, it remains tied to a single source of authority. And when that authority begins to reconsider, even the largest ships in the world start to feel temporary. The question is no longer whether the voyages can continue. It is whether they will be allowed to, and eventually the answer arrives not with a dramatic announcement, not with a final voyage marked by ceremony and reflection, but with something far more decisive and far more unsettling. It simply stops. The great expeditions of Jangur, once the most ambitious maritime display the world had ever seen, begin to fade, not at sea, but at their source. The Ming dynasty turns inward, its priorities shifting away from distant horizons and back toward its own borders. The reasoning is practical, sensible even. Resources are needed elsewhere. Threats closer to home demand attention. The cost of maintaining such vast fleets, ships, crews, supplies, coordination no longer feels justified when weighed against more immediate concerns. Exploration, after all, does not defend a frontier. So the shipyards grow quiet. Where there had once been the constant rhythm of construction, wood shaping into holes, sails prepared, crews assembled, there is now stillness. Tools rest unused, timber lies untouched. The scale that once defined the coastline disappears, leaving behind only space where something extraordinary used to exist. The fleet returns, but not as it once did. Not as a force preparing to depart again, but as something concluded. Sailors disperse. Some return to ordinary lives, carrying memories that few around them can fully understand. Others remain within the system, their skills redirected, their experiences quietly absorbed into a structure that no longer intends to use them in the same way. And Jangur himself, once the central figure of this vast operation, recedes into history in much the same manner as the voyages he commanded, gradually without spectacle. His legacy, like the fleet's, becomes something less visible, not erased, not entirely forgotten, but quieter. Records remain, though not always emphasized. Stories survive, though not always told. The physical evidence, the ships, the routes, the constant movement no longer exists to reinforce what once was. And without repetition, even the largest achievements begin to feel distant, almost unreal. Across the ports that once watched those towering ships arrive, memory lingers. A story of a fleet so vast, it seemed impossible. Of envoys bearing gifts, of encounters that reshaped expectations, if only briefly. But memory fades, and the ocean, patient as ever, returns to its usual state. Empty horizon, open water, no sign that it once carried something so immense. Because, in the end, the greatest voyages in history did not end in disaster. They ended in silence. And silence, as it turns out, is remarkably effective. Not at erasing history completely. That would be too efficient. But at softening it, blurring edges, turning something vast and undeniable into something that feels distant, almost optional. The voyages of Jung-ho do not vanish overnight. They linger faintly in records, in scattered accounts, in the quiet knowledge held by those who were there. But without continuation, without repetition, even the most extraordinary achievements begin to lose their weight, because history, like memory, favors what continues, and these voyages did not. The Ming dynasty chose stability over spectacle, control over projection. The oceans, once briefly transformed into extensions of imperial influence, were left to return to their natural state, open, indifferent, and available for someone else to interpret differently, and eventually, someone did. Centuries later, other ships would cross those same waters, smaller at first, less refined, often less organized, but driven by a different idea. Not to display power, but to expand it permanently. Trade routes would become networks, networks would become control, and control over time would reshape entire regions. In that future, the earlier voyages would seem almost unbelievable. A fleet larger than anything that followed, yet leaving no lasting colonies. A presence felt across continents, yet withdrawing without claiming them. A moment of overwhelming capability, followed by deliberate restraint. It does not fit the pattern people expect, which is perhaps why it becomes easier to overlook. But the truth remains quietly persistent. For a brief period in the early 15th century, the world experienced something rare, a civilization capable of reaching far beyond its borders, choosing not to stay, and then stepping back as if the entire endeavor had simply been optional. No conquest, no lasting occupation, no permanent mark carved into distant lands, just arrival, exchange, departure, and then silence. It is tempting to see this as a missed opportunity, or perhaps, depending on how one prefers their history, as a restraint few others have ever demonstrated. Either way, the legacy of Jung-ho does not shout. It does not dominate maps or define borders. It lingers instead quietly, almost patiently, waiting for someone to notice that once the largest fleet in the world crossed the oceans and then chose to disappear. The fall does not begin with death. It begins with a quiet, unbearable moment, when both of them understand that the future has already chosen a side, and it is not theirs. After the defeat at Actium, the world around Mark Antony and Cleopatra II does not collapse in flames or chaos. There is no dramatic unraveling, no immediate collapse of power. Instead, everything continues with an almost insulting sense of normality. Ships still dock, servants still move through the halls, orders are still given. Life continues as if nothing has happened, which of course makes it worse. They return to Egypt, not as conquerors regrouping, but as survivors rehearsing confidence. Reports are read, advisors speak carefully, choosing their words like men stepping across thin ice. Numbers are discussed, troops, ships, allies, because numbers suggest control, and control is something they are both quietly running out of. But the illusion holds for now. Antony, once a man who commanded loyalty with ease, finds himself speaking with just a little, more force than necessary, as if volume might replace certainty. Cleopatra, sharper, more composed, watches everything. Every glance, every hesitation, because she understands something he is only beginning to accept. This is not a temporary setback. This is a shift, and far away, moving with the patience of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. Octavian advances, not recklessly, not dramatically, but with the slow, controlled pressure of inevitability. He does not need to rush. Time is now his ally. Each passing day weakens them, not just militarily, but psychologically. Allies reconsider. Loyalties soften. Messages become less certain, less frequent. The network that once supported Antony begins to feel fragile, like something already breaking, just not loudly enough to be acknowledged. Inside the palace, the atmosphere changes in ways that are difficult to name, but impossible to ignore. Conversations end more quickly. Silence lingers longer. Even the air feels heavier, as if the walls themselves are aware that something irreversible has already begun, because this is the cruel part of a slow fall. You do not lose everything at once. You lose it piece by piece while still being expected to act as if it all remains intact. And in those first days after defeat, both Antony and Cleopatra begin to understand a truth neither of them can openly admit. The war is not over, but it has already been decided. And because the war feels decided, they do the only thing left that still resembles power. They perform it. Inside Alexandria, Cleopatra III refuses to let the city sense weakness. If collapse is coming, it will not arrive announced. It will not arrive easily. Instead, she rebuilds the image of control piece by piece, like someone repairing a cracked mirror and hoping no one looks too closely. Ceremonies continue. Audiences are granted. Gold still moves through the palace, measured and displayed with calculated precision. The message is clear. Egypt remains strong. Egypt remains wealthy. Egypt remains untouched. It is a convincing performance until you listen more carefully. Behind the rituals, decisions grow sharper, more urgent. Cleopatra begins securing what can be secured. Treasure gathered, routes considered, contingencies quietly formed. Not spoken aloud, not confirmed, but present, like a shadow behind every plan. Because she is not just preserving power, she is preparing for its end. Meanwhile, Mark Antony attempts something more difficult. He tries to reclaim momentum. Messages are sent to allies who have not yet openly abandoned him. Promises are made of recovery, of renewed strength, of one final stand that will correct everything. He speaks as he always has, with confidence, with conviction, with the expectation that others will follow. But something has changed. The responses when they come lack weight. Some are delayed. Some are vague. Some do not arrive at all. The silence between replies becomes its own kind of answer. Still, he pushes forward. Troops are reviewed, positions discussed, strategies proposed. Each action carefully structured to resemble preparation rather than desperation. Because admitting desperation would make it real. And real is something neither of them can afford. Between them, an unspoken understanding grows. They do not discuss defeat directly. That would be too final. Instead, they speak around it through plans, through gestures, through shared glances that linger just slightly longer than before. He still believes something can be salvaged. She knows something must be controlled. Outside, the world shifts, quietly in their absence. Inside, they maintain the appearance of stability, but the truth, patient and unbothered by performance, continues to settle in. Control once lost does not return because it is declared, and every day they spend pretending to hold it is another day it slips further away, and eventually performance stops convincing the people who are performing it. At first, the cracks are subtle, a hesitation before an order is given, a glance exchanged between officers that lingers just a second too long, a report that sounds confident but feels rehearsed. Inside the palace of Alexandria, everything still functions, but it no longer flows. It strains. Mark Antony begins to notice it in the army first. Soldiers still stand in formation. Commands are still obeyed, but the energy is different. Loyalty, once immediate and unquestioned, now carries weight. It asks for reassurance, and reassurance is something Antony no longer has in abundance. He walks among them, speaks to them, reminds them of past victories, because the past at least still belongs to him. He invokes campaigns, battles, moments where everything seemed inevitable in his favor. And for a moment, it works, but only for a moment, because memory is not the same as momentum. Meanwhile, Cleopatra III sees the cracks elsewhere in the court, in the advisors who now speak more cautiously, measuring every word as if it might be remembered later, under less forgiving circumstances. Some begin to distance themselves, not openly, not foolishly, but in small, precise ways, less direct involvement, fewer bold suggestions, a careful neutrality that feels to those paying attention like preparation, because everyone in the palace understands something no one wants to say. If Octavian arrives, and he will, there will be consequences. And survival, as always, has a way of reshaping loyalty. Rumors begin to move through the city. Quiet at first, then less so. Stories of approaching forces, of alliances shifting, of Rome closing in, not with urgency, but with patience, the worst kind. Inside the palace, tension settles into everything. Conversations become shorter, decisions become heavier. Even silence begins to feel deliberate, as if everyone is waiting for someone else to say what cannot yet be spoken. Antony grows more forceful. Cleopatra grows more controlled. Both understand in their own ways that time is no longer neutral. It is working against them. And as the days pass, the illusion of stability becomes harder to maintain. Not because it has been openly challenged, but because it is slowly, quietly losing the support of those who once believed in it. Because the most dangerous moment in any fall is not the beginning. It is the point where everyone realizes this is not going to stop. And once everyone realizes it will not stop, distance becomes the only illusion left, because Octavian is no longer a distant problem. He is movement, direction, pressure that does not announce itself loudly, but advances all the same. Reports begin to arrive with uncomfortable consistency. Cities that once leaned toward Mark Antony are now reconsidering, not rebelling, not openly declaring loyalty to Rome, just adjusting. Gates open more easily to Octavian's envoys. Supplies become less available. Conversations shift tone. Nothing dramatic, everything decisive. Octavian does not attack recklessly. He does not rush forward in a single overwhelming strike. Instead, he tightens slowly, methodically, like someone who understands that victory is not about speed. It is about removing options. And one by one, those options begin to disappear. Inside Alexandria, the news arrives in fragments. A port lost here, a commander defecting there, a supply line quietly interrupted, each report on its own manageable. Together, something else entirely, something irreversible. Antony reacts the only way he knows how, through action. He prepares for confrontation. Troops are repositioned. Defense is reinforced. Plans drawn not for retreat, but for resistance. Because in his world, conflict is something you face directly, something you meet head-on and resolve through force. It has worked before. It has always worked before. But this is not the same kind of war. Cleopatra sees it more clearly. From within the palace, she studies the movement not as a soldier, but as a ruler who understands power beyond the battlefield. Octavian is not trying to defeat Antony in a single clash. He is isolating him, separating him from allies, from resources, from confidence itself. Each step designed not just to weaken his position, but to make that weakness visible. Because once weakness is seen, it spreads. And Alexandria, for all its wealth and history, begins to feel less like a stronghold and more like a final position, the last place left. The city continues its rhythm. Markets open, ships arrive, life moves. But beneath it all, the awareness grows. People sense change long before they understand it. They feel the shift in tone, the tightening in conversation, the way uncertainty settles into everything without asking permission. Rome is not here yet, but it is close enough to be felt. And as that distance shrinks, one uncomfortable truth becomes impossible to ignore. There will be no negotiation that restores what has been lost, only a choice on how to face what is coming. And once the choice is narrow, action becomes less about victory and more about delay. Inside Alexandria, both Mark Antony and Cleopatra III understand this, though neither says it aloud. There is still movement, still planning, still the outward structure of resistance. But beneath it, something has shifted. They are no longer trying to win the war. They are trying to shape how it ends. Anthony moves first. He organizes what remains of his forces, determined to confront Octavian directly. Because if there is any chance left, any narrow opening, it lies in action. A decisive strike, a final engagement that might disrupt the slow tightening that has brought them to this point. His soldiers follow, not with the certainty they once had, but with something quieter. Habit, loyalty, and perhaps the faint hope that one last effort might still matter. Lines are drawn, positions taken. The familiar rhythm of preparation returns, almost comforting in its simplicity. But even here the cracks remain. Orders are carried out, but without the same conviction. Movements are precise, but lack momentum. The army still exists, but it no longer feels like a force capable of changing the direction of events. Cleopatra, meanwhile, prepares in a different way. Her focus is not the battlefield, it is outcome. Within the palace, she begins securing what can still be controlled. Wealth is gathered, treasures moved, plans whispered among the few she still trusts, not for escape exactly, but for preservation, of legacy, of dignity, of something that will remain when everything else does not. She even considers negotiation. Carefully, quietly, messages are sent, measured, deliberate, testing whether there is any path that allows her to separate her fate from Antony's, not out of betrayal, but survival. Because she understands something clearly now. Rome does not need both of them, and it will not spare both of them. But these attempts, military, political, personal, begin to feel like movements within a space that is already closing. Each effort precise, each decision calculated, and yet none of them seem large enough, because Octavian does not react. He continues forward, steady, uninterrupted, as if everything they do has already been accounted for. And that is the most unsettling realization of all. Not that they're losing, but that nothing they try is capable of changing how this ends. And when nothing changes the outcome, something else begins to change instead. The man at the center of it. Mark Antony had built his life on momentum, on action, loyalty, presence. He was a man who moved forward and expected the world to move with him. Battles were not just fought. They were decided by will, by force, by the ability to push harder than the opponent standing across from him. But now there is nothing left to push. The final engagements begin. Not grand decisive battles, but smaller confrontations that confirm what has already been unfolding. His forces meet those of Octavian and fail to hold. Not dramatically, just consistently. Units withdraw too early. Positions break too easily. Some do not engage at all. The structure of command remains, but the substance behind it has thinned. Loyalty, once unquestioned, now bends under pressure and sometimes simply disappears. Antony sees it. He does not need reports. He does not need explanations. He recognizes the pattern immediately because he has spent his entire life on this other side of it. He knows what a losing army looks like. He has just never stood inside one before. Back in Alexandria, the weight settles in fully. There is no longer a strategy to recover the situation. No hidden reserve. No final maneuver waiting to be revealed. What remains is recognition. The kind that arrives slowly, then all at once. The war is over. Everything that follows is consequence. His behavior begins to shift, not outwardly at first, but in small, telling ways. Decisions come slower. Silence stretches longer. The certainty that once defined him gives way to something quieter, less stable. Doubt. Not the kind that can be dismissed with a bold speech or a decisive order. The kind that sits in the background, persistent, reshaping every thought. And yet, he continues because stopping would mean admitting what he already understands. Cleopatra watches this carefully. She does not intervene directly. There is no confrontation, no dramatic exchange, but she sees the change clearly, because where Antony once carried the weight of action, he now carries the weight of inevitability. And inevitability is heavier. Outside, the city holds its breath. Inside, the collapse is no longer strategic. It is personal because the final stage of any great fall is not the loss of territory. It is the loss of the belief that it can still be regained. And for Antony, that belief is beginning to disappear. And as Antony's certainty fades, something else sharpens. Not hope, not optimism, calculation. Cleopatra Theth has watched power long enough to understand its final stage. It does not collapse loudly. It narrows. It becomes a series of decisions, each smaller than the last, each more personal than political. And now those decisions belong to her. Inside the palace, she withdraws. Not completely, not visibly, but just enough to create distance. Fewer public appearances, fewer shared moments. Not out of abandonment, but clarity, because she understands something Antony cannot fully accept. What remains is no longer about them together. It is about what survives them. She begins to prepare with precision. Treasure is gathered, not displayed, not counted for reassurance, but secured, hidden, moved into spaces that feel less like royal chambers and more like contingency. Documents are arranged, loyal attendants chosen carefully, not for comfort, but for reliability. Even her tomb, already under construction, takes on a different meaning, not as a symbol of future glory, but as a place of control. Because Cleopatra intends to decide how this ends. Not Rome, not Octavian, her. At the same time, she tests the edges of possibility. Messages are sent again, subtle, deliberate, toward Octavian. Not pleading, not desperate, but measured. An attempt to understand the limits of his intentions. Would he spare her? Would he separate her from Antony? Would Egypt in some diminished form be allowed to continue under her control? The answers, when they come, are careful, polite, controlled, non-committal, which in this context means no. Octavian does not need her power. He needs her submission. And Cleopatra, who has ruled long enough to recognize the difference, understands exactly what that would look like. Not a queen, a symbol displayed, controlled, reduced, unacceptable. So the calculations shift again. No longer focused on survival within Rome's system, but on something else entirely. Preserving dignity, shaping memory, deciding what version of her story will remain when everything else is taken. Antony remains close, but no longer central to these decisions. Not because she has stopped caring, but because the outcome has moved beyond what either of them can change together. Outside, the city tightens under the pressure of what is coming. Inside, Cleopatra becomes quieter, more deliberate, because the final act is approaching, and she has no intention of leaving it unfinished or worse, written by someone else. And in the end, it does not come through strategy or negotiation or even battle. It comes through a mistake. As Octavian closes in on Alexandria, the final defenses collapse with the same quiet inevitability that has defined everything leading up to this moment. There is no grand last stand, only fragments of resistance, breaking apart under pressure that no longer needs to prove itself. Inside the city, confusion spreads faster than truth. Reports move quickly, too quickly. And somewhere in that movement, a message reaches Mark Antony, a message that changes everything. Cleopatra is dead. It is not true. But truth at this point no longer has the authority it once did. Antony does not verify it. He does not question it, because it fits too perfectly into the shape of what is already happening. The fall, the isolation, the inevitability. This is simply the final piece. And so, he acts not as a general, not as a strategist, but as a man who has run out of outcomes. He retreats briefly into what remains of his private space, There are no speeches, no witnesses gathered to record the moment, just a decision made in silence. With the kind of clarity that only arrives when all other paths have disappeared, he chooses the end. The act itself is not immediate, not clean. History rarely grants that kind of efficiency. Wounded but not yet gone, he is carried still alive, still conscious, toward the place where Cleopatra has sealed herself inside her monument, because she is not dead, and when he reaches her, the truth arrives too late to change anything. They are reunited briefly in a moment that is less dramatic than it is heavy. No declarations, no grand final words that echo across time, just recognition of what has happened, of what is about to happen. He dies there, not on a battlefield, not in command, but in the presence of the only person who remained with him until the end. Outside, the city continues to shift toward its conclusion. Inside, something else settles. Because with Antony's death, the illusion of shared fate disappears. What remains is singular. Cleopatra stands alone now, and the final decision, the one she has been preparing for all along, is no longer theoretical. It is immediate. And now with Antony gone, there is no illusion left to maintain, only decision. Inside her sealed monument, Cleopatra Thruth exists in a space that feels removed from the world outside. Not protected, not safe, but separate. The noise of Alexandria, the movement of armies, the steady advance of Octavian, all of it continues, but at a distance. For a moment, she allows herself stillness, not weakness, not grief in the way others might expect, but something quieter. A pause between what has ended and what must now be done, because the outcome is no longer uncertain. Octavian enters Alexandria. Control is established quickly, efficiently. Resistance, what little remains, dissolves. The city that once held, power now holds consequence. And Cleopatra knows what comes next. She is taken into custody, not violently, not roughly, but with a careful restraint that feels somehow more final. Octavian does not mistreat her. He does not insult her. He does not need to. His intentions are clear. He plans to keep her alive, to display her, to bring her to Rome not as a queen, but as proof, a symbol of victory, of conquest, of the end of everything she represented, a living reminder of his success, and that more than death is unacceptable. She listens, watches, calculates. Even now, there are still small freedoms, small movements, small opportunities left within the structure that holds her. Enough to act if she chooses the right moment, and she does. The details, as history preserves them, remain uncertain, almost deliberately so. A serpent, a hidden poison, a method carried quietly into her chamber. What matters is not the exact mechanism, it is the choice. She refuses to be reduced, refuses to be displayed, controlled, remembered as something diminished. If her story is ending, it will end on her terms. Not as a captive, not as a symbol of someone else's victory, but as a queen. Her final moments are not loud, not theatrical. There is no audience, no spectacle crafted for others to interpret, just intention carried through without hesitation, and then stillness. Outside, the city continues under new authority. Rome secures its position. The future begins to take shape, indifferent to the individuals who shaped it. But inside that final chamber, something else is decided. Because Cleopatra's last act does not prevent defeat. It defines it. And in doing so, it ensures that even in loss, her story will not belong entirely to Rome, but to the choice she made at the very